Welcome. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. Thank you, especially Richard, for
It's a great pleasure to be in Maine.
and talking to us. I think a lot of people are interested to know when somebody like you, who has lived in a lot of places, lived in Montana, New Orleans, New Jersey, and could live anywhere because you write for a living. How did you pick Maine? How and why did you come to Maine?
Well, Christina, my wife, had a job. She was the head of city planning for the city of New Orleans, and we were living in New Orleans, where I grew up. And I desperately wanted her to quit her job and come and live with me someplace. But it was a job of a lifetime for her, and she just wasn't going to leave it. And so I decided, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go find a place you can't resist. And so I started in New Jersey, where we had lived and we loved New Jersey. And I just went up the coast until I just would go here to there, here to there, here to there, finding a place where I thought it would be a nice place to live, and I could then entice her to come up there and live with me. And ultimately, I hooked up with a realtor in Belfast, and we looked at 40 houses. And all I wanted to do was live on the ocean. And she one day said, "Come down to Booth Bay." She said, I want to show you a house. I'd never been in Booth Bay. I didn't know a soul there. She showed me the house, and I called Christina up on the phone. I said, "You better fly up here right now." And I said, "Because this is the house of a lifetime." So
You bought the house and then you called.
no, we don't have that kind of marriage. I called, and then she came, and we looked at the house together, and I bought it. We bought it.
And what specifically, what was the lure, do you think, of that spot, at least Booth Bay or of Maine overall, the lure of why you really wanted to, why you thought it would be the place for you guys to settle down?
Well, I never imagined settling down. I just imagined this would be a place to live. I had never lived there before, and it was on the ocean. The house was a spectacular place to live, and it was, again, I didn't know a soul. I just liked it. I just think, my God, if you'd ever see it, you would like it too. Yeah, it wasn't very complicated, frankly. I just saw this spectacular house, and I thought I have enough money to buy this, and I'm going to buy it. Which is sort of how we've always done things. We don't have any children. We don't go about the business of deciding where we're going to live as if it were a science. We just sort of look at a place and decide we like it, and we buy a house and move there. And we've done that all over. We've done it in New Jersey, we've done it in Montana, we've done it in New Orleans, we've done it in Vermont, we've done it all over the place, Chicago, all over the place.
And what kinds of things do you like to do in Maine? I mean, you got here, did you find yourself taking up?
Exactly whenever I've been on boats with my friends, and a lot of my friends have boats, I've always felt like I was in prison. And they were doing all the talking, and I was just listening. And so Well, what we did was, Christina and I are both grouse hunters. And so we troop up to Aroostook County or Penobscot County and with our dogs and chase around after grouse in the big woods up there, which is great. It's wonderful. I made virtually no use of the ocean other than to go in it. I would get in it a lot. But, it was just a nice place to live. It's sort of the line of Emerson's, I take my giant with me where I go. I just wanted to go to work. I just wanted a wonderful place to live and go down to this boathouse, which was on our property, and we converted it into a study for me. And I went down there and wrote a bunch of books, which is what I meant to do. Because I was not 60 years old, and so I still had some books left.
Do you find that Maine, living by the ocean or living in Maine, inspired you or helped your writing in any way? Or?
Absolutely, just didn't get in my way. I have one inspiration. One inspiration was in 1968. Christina and I were just about to get married. We were in my mother's apartment in Arkansas, in Little Rock. And she said to me, well, when we get married next week, what are you going to do? Fair enough. I said, well, because I had failed at most everything else. Failed, yeah, Marine Corps, law school, all that stuff. I said, I think I'm going to try to be a writer. She said, oh, good. She said, that's a great idea. She said, you stay home and write, and I'll get a job and make money. I thought, well, that's an offer I cannot refuse. So that was my only inspiration, which is that I asked her I told her what I was thinking of, and she said it was a good idea, and I've been basically running on those fumes ever since. 57 years.
But these other things that you mentioned, so how did you come to pursue and then fail at these things? Like why did you join the Marine Corps? What did you think of that as a career at some point?
Yeah, I did. I joined the Marine Corps because we were all going to get drafted, and nobody wanted to get drafted. At least I didn't want to get drafted, and so I just one day went over to the post office in Little Rock where my mother lived and just joined the Marines. Just one afternoon, came back and I said to my mother, she said, where have you been? I said, I was just joining the Marines. She said, oh my gosh. She said, but I was in the Marines not for very long, and then I got hepatitis. I got sick, and they threw me out. And then I re-enrolled and re-enlisted, and then they threw me out again because I wasn't quite well enough then. And so I wanted to be a lawyer in the Marine Corps, and because I knew I was going to go to law school. And I thought it would be a good way, because I thought being in the Marines was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I still think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to have done. Yeah.
When did you first think about being a writer, though? Had you as a kid? Had you been the kind of kid who wrote stories or read a lot? Or
No, I was a juvenile delinquent. I was in trouble with the police, in the juvenile courts. Dyslexic, I'm pretty seriously dyslexic, at least then, not so much now. I just wasn't easily tameable. And so being a writer or being in anything was the last thing I had in mind. I couldn't really project beyond 1962 when I got out of high school. My father died when I was 16. And then I got a little more serious, and then my grandparents came into my life, and they were fairly doting and solicitous of me, and they sort of looked at me and thought, well, you could, because they were in the hotel business in Little Rock. I think my grandfather ran an enormous hotel. He said, why don't you do this? Why don't you be a hotel person, be a hotel manager? And so that's why I applied to Michigan State, because they had a really good hotel school, and it got me the hell out of the South, and where I wasn't fitting in. So I went to Michigan State to be in the hotel school, and I failed at that. It lasted one semester, and then I switched over to literature, because I thought reading books was a lot more interesting than reading about accounting and how you buy brooms and things like that. And so then I just stuck it out. I went off with 4 years and studied literature. Went to law school at Washington University in St. Louis. But I was so in love that at the end of my first semester, I moved to New York, and Christina and I got married.
And where did the lawyer idea come in? Did that spring from the fact that you were always in trouble with the law as a juvenile delinquent, and you figured get yourself out of trouble? Or?
Yeah, but, bad behavior makes good stories. And I had a lot of bad behavior. But I don't know. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. A horrible place. It's churchy and bigoted and racist and not a good place. But Eudora Welty lived 3 blocks away, and we would see Eudora, my mother and I would see Eudora in the grocery store. And one time my mother said, she said, Richard, I was 8, you see that woman right over there? She said, that's Eudora Welty. She's a writer. And I had no idea at 8 what a writer was. But I knew that by the way my mother said that it was a vocation of some kind that she revered. And then as time went on, Faulkner was living in Oxford, Eudora was living in Jackson. Walker Percy was living in New Orleans. All around us was the license of literature that if for whatever reason you thought you liked words or you thought, and I was dyslexic, so I liked words a lot. The idea that you could be a writer was always available in that
No, mine's gone.
flurry. No, I came back. Maybe I went flurry. So living in Jackson, for all of its not good qualities, did have that. It had these wonderful, world-class writers living where you could see them in the grocery store.
So it put the idea in your head that you could be a writer from this place, from places like this.
That's right.
It's kind of the way a lot of writers who grew up in Maine talk about Stephen King. They grow up thinking, well, if Stephen King can live in Bangor, I can grow up in Maine and be a writer.
I think that's immensely informative to young people, immensely encouraging to young people. If they have whatever it takes to think that you want to spend your life writing sentences and listening to language that comes out of your own head. Not everybody wants to do that.
When you talk about bad behavior makes good stories, so how much of these other things that you tried to do or pursued makes its way into your writing?
Plenty, absolutely plenty. I have a kind of fascination with transgressive behavior, no doubt about that. But just in a more innocent way. When I was 17, I quit what I was doing, went to work on the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and was a fireman for a while until the firemen all got laid off. And then after that, I was a switchman. And a lot of that material, which was for a 17, 18-year-old boy, it's the most delicious thing you could possibly be doing. You're with grown men who are working, doing these sometimes dangerous but always highly skilled things. And when I was 17, I could only hold down a job because you bid these jobs in. It's called the extra board. You bid at a job from 12 to 8, from midnight to 8 o'clock. And it was the only job I could hold because I was so unskilled and I was so young. But I would get on these engines with these old head firemen, engineers, the yard engines, and they held down those 12 to 8 jobs because they were all alcoholics. And you could run the switch engine all over the yard in the middle of the night, and the yard master was not around there to take your picture, which is what they would do if they saw you being drunk on the job. And it usually after about 4 hours of the shift, these guys would say, get over here, Ford, and run this engine. I was like, run this engine? I didn't know how to run the engine, but they made me run the engine. And here I'm running the engine at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'm 17 years old, and I've got three switchmen on the ground, all with lanterns out there in the dark someplace. That was just pretty cool. So I put that in stories for sure. That's the way if you're lucky enough to have that kind of experience and you're a writer, well, then you just have to write about that.
You're talking about your grandparents who ran the hotel too in Little Rock. Did that, or your grandfather too was a boxer, right? And he was a boxer and he ran the hotel. I didn't know, does he make his way into any of your stories or inspire
Well, he
characters?
certainly is a figure of some interest to me. I mean, he made me, because I was getting into so many fights and I was getting beat up. And he took me aside and said, you have to learn how to protect yourself. So he made me go to the boys club in Little Rock and do the Golden Gloves, which I wasn't very good at, but I got better at it. But he was a sort of a boulevardier. I mean, sort of a wide character, lots of jokes. Ran this big hotel, and hotels are places where people go where they want to do things that they don't want other people to know about. And that's what people did in that hotel. It had 600 rooms, and I was the manager's grandson. And so I had complete run of the place and learned how to do all of the things that you had to do. Run the PBX. Some of you know what a PBX is. It was a PBX. I did that. I hopped bells. I waited tables. I worked in the front office. I did all of those things. And sometimes when in the middle of the night, something would happen in the hotel, and my grandfather would say, get up, Dick, we're going to go down and look at something. And sometimes it was somebody who had committed suicide. Or sometimes it was two people together who shouldn't be together in one room. All kinds of things happen in hotels. And he thought that it was good for me if I saw all of that and experienced all of it. And I can't say he was wrong. I've said a lot of things in hotels. You know, I love hotels. I'm never happier than when I'm in hotels.
When you started writing, when you got married and your wife basically said, "I'm going to support you and you can start writing,"
That's exactly what she said.
where did your first ideas, I guess, come from? Your first couple novels or stories?
Well, you know, I didn't know how to do it. I read a lot of stories. I'd read all of Sherwood Anderson. I read all of Frank O'Connor. I read Chekhov. I read Hemingway. I read Faulkner. I read Welty. Well, I hadn't read Welty. Didn't get around to reading Welty. So my only way of knowing what a story was what I had read, because I had no real experience in putting them together myself. And it took me actually quite a while to understand how, with whatever skills I had, I could make stories. Because the way you read a story from start to finish, at least in my practice, is not the way I make stories up. I don't make them as linear things so much as mosaical kinds of structures made of language. And so it took me a long time of sort of figuring out and struggling how to make stories make sense to be able to do it. And I had to fail at it and not get anything published for 8 years. And just, little by little, figure out what I had to do. It was an apprenticeship.
And what was the secret? Did you find a secret, a key?
The secret was fear of failure. Yeah, I think it probably more than anything. That was it. Yeah.
I don't think that's a secret. I think most people are motivated by the fear of failure.
But I also had Christina there, and she was always encouraging. And when I would have these meltdowns and failures and nothing was getting published and nothing was happening, she was always reading what I was trying to write and talking to me about it. And it was just the two of us, just like it is now. She was the linchpin. You asked what the linchpin was. It was that. And she was encouraging. She didn't just say, I'll go to work and you stay home and write stories. She said, I'll go to work and I'll come home and I'll read what you write.
But you wrote novels for a while and then worked as a sports writer, is that right? And is that because the novels weren't?
The novels were the novels I wrote. And they both got published and they both had people writing things about them, and nobody was particularly, except for Alice Hoffman. She was mean. But after I wrote 2 novels and nobody had read them, I thought, well, it's time for this boy to go to work and make money. So I asked my agent if he would find somebody who would put me to work writing. And he went to what was a magazine then called Inside Sports, and they said, sure, we'll put him to work. So they put me to work writing stuff, which I did for a year and a half or close to 2, and then it went out of business. Newsweek owned it, and Newsweek sold it, and I tried to get a job at Sports Illustrated, and they wouldn't give me a job because they said I was a novelist. They didn't want me to work around there because they thought I would be hard to edit, and I would have been. So then I just went back down to New Jersey and down to Princeton, and I looked around and I said to Christina, I said, I'm going to try this one more time. I said, because writing novels is the only thing I haven't really completely failed at. And so then I wrote The Sports Writer. And that was a novel that it's a good novel, but it also found people who wanted to read it, which was the first time I ever had a readership.
And since that's about a sports writer, how much of that is based on your experience or your life up to that point?
It was none of it. None of it. At least not no. But it was based on a lot of what I thought about sports writing and what I could make myself say about sports writing. But as far as the things that Frank does, in that book, I had never done that. I just made up a task for him, an assignment for him to fly out to Detroit to interview a former Detroit Lions football player who had become a quadriplegic. And I had never done that, but I thought, well, someone could do that. So I had him do that. But, most of writing novels is not so much basing things on what you've done yourself. It's based on what you can make yourself say something about. Most people who write novels are just looking for something to say. And it was a wonderful line of Northrop Frye's, which is a line I love, and Frye says that literature is a disinterested use of language. You must have nothing writing on the outcome. And I'll repeat that because it's worth remembering. Literature is a disinterested use of language. You must have nothing writing on the outcome. And what he means by that is that's how the imagination works. The imagination is not tethered to some predisposed notion of what you're going to write. I mean, I know I'm going to write a story about a guy who's a sports writer, but what I think about that, or what I make him think, is I have no commitment to what I make him think. I just make it up, and which is great.
So you find for your creative process, it's better to not base it in your own, write about yourself, your own experience, but to go for something completely different. Even though he was a sports writer, you tried to make him.
I tried to make him interesting. I've not spent my life trying to live an interesting life. I spent my life trying to write interesting books, and sometimes that because I'm going to be spending a lot of those years in a room somewhere with my little big pen writing sentences, and that can be not a terribly interesting. I mean, internally, in one's joys and tribulations of trying to make this be good, that can be quite exhilarating. But by and large, it's staying one place and doing that thing. And so, but I can dream up for my characters and dream up for them to say all kinds of interesting things, all kinds of funny things, because I'm naturally, as my mother used to call my mother, who didn't know I was dyslexic, and she would always say, she would say, the comedian, you're always the comedian. She always thought I was trying to make people laugh, and I was, because I was trying to sort of deflect their attention away from the fact that I was such a terrible student.
And when you talk about, I was going to ask about a little more about Frank Bascombe, and so the books, you ended up writing 5 books over 5 or 4 decades, I guess. Almost one a decade.
A long time.
Almost a decade about him. What? How did that come about? Was that? Did you plan to keep writing them, or at some point did you just decide that okay, after I wrote this one, then I don't know, a few years later I want to revisit it, or how do you?
Well, I wrote one, and I thought to myself, well, I'm just a guy who writes one book at a time, and here's my one book. Sports writer. It did well. People said it was a good book. And then I went about writing a bookstore called Rock Springs. Went about writing 2 or 3 other things, and then I came upon a notion about a man who takes his son to the Baseball Hall of Fame. I thought that was a good premise for a book, as a way of reclaiming his affections for his son, and the son's reclaiming affections for his father. And I was monkeying around with this stuff for a year, as I do, collecting material. And I kept bumping into the fact that all of my notes and all of my trial sentences were in Frank's voice. And I thought, oh man, you don't have that kind of ambition. You don't have the ambition to write connected books. And more to the point, if you wrote this book opposite to Frank in the first book, you'd probably just be writing the same book over again. So I had a lot of reasons not to do it, to be fearful of doing it. Until finally I said to myself, you nitwit, you are being given this voice, which you can create on the page, and that people will read and like. So don't run away from this. Run toward this. And so I ran toward it. So that became Independence Day, and it was Frank Bascombe because I could do, in a sense, could do no other.
And of course, you won the Pulitzer Prize for that book, and so you're saying you almost didn't write it at some point.
Well, I think all books are things that almost don't happen. I think in every writer's life, there are many, many moments in which you think to yourself, screw it. I'm not going to do this. This is either too boring, or it's too hard, or it doesn't succeed. And so that's not unusual. I mean, sometimes when I was teaching at Columbia, my students would come to me and they would say, I'm in real trouble. And I would say, well, okay, it's an indoor sport, so you're not in real trouble. He said, I have lost my faith in what I'm doing. And I would always say, shit, I lose faith in what I'm doing twice a day. Yeah. If you can't lose faith in what you're doing, it probably isn't worth doing. And so you just have to think to yourself, there are going to be days when I'm doing this, and this is not hard work, but it's just constant work, in which you think to yourself, this isn't any good. What I'm writing just isn't any good. And then you just have to get beyond that.
Since you've spent a lot of time probably thinking about Frank Bascombe and listening to his voice, a reader had, or an audience member had sent in this question: if Frank Bascombe were asked to invite 3 notable figures from the past to dinner, who would he invite?
Why does anybody want to know that? I cannot possibly answer a question like that. It's just the most.
I also had a question about when.
I guess we want to answer that.
This is from a reader, but I think you'll like this one better.
Mahatma Gandhi, right? I want to be.
You were talking about how when you were trying to figure out how to write, and you'd only read books and you didn't really figure out how to construct them yet. I wonder now, when you think about it, do you start with a plot, or do you sort of start with the characters and let them work it out, or do you even envision an ending at some point?
I'll give you an example, because that's a reasonable question. I'd written this little book called Wildlife, and Christina and I were living in a little town that basically isn't there anymore, called Dutton, Montana, and I was waiting around for the galleys to come back from my book, and so I rented a little room above a car repair and went up there and pretended to be writing. But I wrote a line in my notebook, and the line in my notebook said, "A boy is taken across the Canadian border against his will," from Montana, because up there in Dutton, it's not far from Canada. And I thought that single line had so much, I don't know, it held something for me, that line, and I can't tell you what it was. But I didn't really start writing the book for 25 years later. And I kept adding to it and adding to it and adding to it. And over the course of the 25 years when I was adding to it, I would say to myself, okay, why would a 16-year-old boy be taken across the Canadian border against his will? So then I would have to dream up, well, his parents, something must have happened to his parents. So what could have happened to his parents? And I thought, well, they could have done a lot of things, but that disrupted the family. But I thought, well, they could have robbed a bank. And I thought, oh, I'd like to write about robbing a bank. So I had it be that he was crossing the border because his parents had robbed the bank. And so the answer to your question is that over the course of the time, it isn't usually 25 years, sometimes it's a year, I kind of see where it can start and where my potent line, if I have a potent line, would lead the action. And I generally know when I start a book where it's going to end geographically and where it's going to end temporally. But when I get to the end, and I have maybe 5 pages to go, sometimes I just throw that end away, the end that I have anticipated, because the book has led me to have resources and led me to have curiosities and interests that I didn't have when I started it. And there's no reason that you should know as much about your book when you start it as you do when you're getting to the end of it. So I generally think I know where things are going. It's a real help, but I don't necessarily have to do it when I get there.
You talked about jotting down that line and then going back to it 25 years later.
Yeah.
So how many notebooks do you have and where do you keep them? I mean, do you
Well,
go back and look?
I keep them in the refrigerator, in an alternate refrigerator. Because I come from Arkies, and they all lived poor up in northwest Arkansas, and they put everything valuable that they had into the icebox, because if the house burned, and these were old dry wooden houses, they burned. But the refrigerator would be the last thing to burn. And so I still stick stuff like that into the freezer or into the refrigerator, something like that. So that I don't lose it. And how many do I have? I have a lot.
Yeah.
I have a lot of notebooks. And when it comes time to think that I would like to write a novel and I have some reason to write a novel, I go through all of those notebooks. And I annotate out of those notebooks things that I see in there that I like. And then I type them up. Type up the notes.
And so do you just keep a notebook with you and jot things down, or do you have a time during the day where you sit down and just think of stuff?
Both, yeah. But I always had it. I always have a notebook with me. I mean, it's in my jacket. But I always have it. Yeah, because to be a writer, at least in my life, is to champion the things that run rampantly through your mind. Nobody can really control what's going on in her or his mind. And I have a use for everything. And so when things just go tripping through my mind at 3 o'clock in the morning, I turn the light on and write it down. I don't have any use for it necessarily. I just think, ooh, that's interesting. So I just write it down. And eventually I have this full notebook, and I go through it and I winnow stuff out and I glean this and save that, and then I have a kind of a residuum of material that I think is interesting, that I would like to see by interesting I mean I'd like to see it on a page, and then I can fit all those things together to make a story. That's when I said it earlier, that it's mosaical more than it is linear. It is very much a matter of putting together things that haven't been together before.
Do you have an idea for a book or a story that you're working on now that you can talk about, maybe where that idea came from?
Well, I can't tell you where it came from, just out of a sense of humility. But I thought about somebody who was going to undergo a assisted suicide, and I'm generally, when I'm thinking about things like this, I'm thinking about a comedy, and so I thought that the person who's going to endure an assisted suicide could be in an academic setting, and he could invite his colleagues, some of them, to be present when he shuffles off. And that was like, for me, the little line about the little boy being taken across the border against his will. When I thought about that, it had a kind of a plumpness to it. I thought, ooh, I can make use of that. I can start a novel there. And then I could think, where the novel gets set, it could be set, and I decided to set it in a little academic community that I make up in eastern Indiana, because I figured nobody in the United States, rather western Indiana, nobody knows where western Indiana even is. Because I wanted to make it obscure enough that I could run it. Whereas if I set it in Michigan, where I know a lot about Michigan, we live there, but Michigan has all of this kind of wonderful literary juju to it, whereas western Indiana doesn't have anything. They're along the river and near the Illinois border. I thought, I could run this. I could make this up and make it be mine. I can be the world's greatest expert about western Indiana. And you have to be able to, captain your own ship. You really have to be able to be the world's greatest expert about what you're writing. Years ago, when I was writing The Sports Writer, I had Frank in a phone booth in a parking lot in a mall near Hightstown, New Jersey, and he's it's a huge big parking lot, but it's mostly empty because it's on a Sunday, it's on Easter Sunday, and this kid is doing donuts in a car in the parking lot, and he actually bangs into the phone booth. This is the years, you can tell how long ago that is. There were such things as phone booths. He bangs into the phone booth and actually injures Frank. And as I wrote it, across this parking lot, there's a diner, and one of the young women who were waiting tables in the diner comes across to see if Frank's okay. And so when she gets there, then I have to describe her. And I didn't know, I had to say what she had on, how she was dressed, what her hair looked like. And I thought, what can I have her wear? What can I have her wear? And I thought, well, I could have her wear a Bruce Springsteen t-shirt. And I thought to myself, no, don't do that. Because if you introduce Bruce Springsteen into this piece of writing, you'll never be able to reclaim it for your own. Springsteen's aura will just take my scene away from me when I'm just sort of basically creeping along trying to make this work, And I told Springsteen that many years later. He didn't care.
You told him that you cut him out of your book?
I said, you almost made it into my book. He thought that was funny.
How do you know Bruce Springsteen?
Let's see. I think I know him because, I love his music all those years, right? And I didn't know him. And I'd had a couple of chances to meet him, and I didn't want to meet him. I was afraid I wouldn't like him, and or that he wouldn't like me. But he wrote something nice about a book of mine. Somebody said to him, tell me the book about New Jersey that you think gets New Jersey better than anybody. He said, I think Richard Ford's novel, The Lay of the Land. And I thought, wow, really? My book? And after that happened, one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. And then the New York Times asked if I would review his memoir. Oh. And I reviewed his memoir. And then after that, we just got in touch. And then in the most normal kinds of ways. We're not bosom buddies. We don't spend Thanksgiving together.
Well, I think we could open it up to questions now. If people are brave enough to ask a question, we have a microphone that we can pass around.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring it to you.
Please. Here's a gentleman in the front.
Hi there.
Hello.
Difficult question before, but Frank is a character I love so much.
Thank you.
And and his, that from the first novel, I felt that the loss of his son was a core sorrow.
Yeah.
That that's as his friend, as a reader, I felt stayed with him throughout all the novels. I felt like somehow that was a core part of something he carried. You know, I wonder if you could talk about how you saw him experience it.
Well, that's an interesting question because when I wrote that book in which the death of his son is a part of it, the first of those Frank Bascombe books, my mother had not long before died. And I think that in a way, and I hate to say things like this because it sounds so new agey, but I think in a way I was kind of channeling my own grief from my mother a bit when I was writing about Frank. And in a way, Christina and I don't have children, so I don't know anything about raising children. I don't even like children. I found that it was possible that what I was feeling, just as a human being, was contributive to what I could say about the death of a son, the death of a child. And so, everyone knows that for parents, the death of a child is the worst possible thing that could conceivably happen, and yet it happens. And so I knew that. I just knew conventional wisdom that those kinds of deaths are irretrievably painful. And all through the years, I could draw on that dead child's existence. But I would have to tell you that you as a reader probably contribute some, and I don't mean to say you make the book up, my book up. I think that it plucked some kind of string in you that resonates in you. It doesn't resonate in me the same way. But it doesn't mean to say that mine is better than yours and yours is better than mine. It's just that I write a book and then you make use of it. And the way you make use of it is always going to be idiopathic. You're just going to do it in your own way. But I never think of Frank as a person. I think of Frank Bascombe as an instrument made of language. And if I think of him that way, and all of the characters that I can write that way, then I have the greatest amount of freedom to make them do unexpected things and surprising things and things that I wouldn't have conceived even possible, but that I was writing them in this book in this way. So and I think for anybody who suffers the loss of a child, inevitably it stays with you and it formulates how you see the world. And so I was just, in one way I was drawing not on my experience, but I was drawing on the conventional spirit of all human beings. And that, by the way, is what I would like to do. I would like to write a book that will draw in the entirety of your experience to bear on the choices that I make. I mean, probably if I had had a son who had died, I probably wouldn't have written about it nearly as well, because I would have been, confined to my own experience. And the whole business of writing books is constantly to be doing this, constantly, because you plan to write a book for a year, and the day before you write the first sentence, everything is possible. Then you write one sentence, and a third of those things is no longer possible. So what you're constantly trying to do as you go through the book is to widen your frame of reference, widen your frame of choice, widen your brain, achieve exactly what Noah Freud said, that literature is a disinterested use of language.
There's a question over here.
Otherwise, you're going to put Ray back to it.
No, somebody's got a hand up over here.
Hello.
So what I'm trying to understand, it sounds almost like you're saying you're discovering them. Like.
I'm making it up. I'm not discovering. It's not there.
When you talk about this.
Yes.
You mean the widening.
Yes.
And when you talk about how the characters sometimes surprise you.
They say.
They surprise you.
Well, I surprise me. They don't do anything. Sometimes I write something that I would have never imagined I would write. But it's always me, it's never them. They're not instructing me, they're not telling me anything. They're just doing what I tell them to do. But, yeah, I mean, is it not true that the people we find to be the most interesting are the people whom we think we know and like, and yet who do things different from what we expect? I mean, I think that's what makes people interesting to us, that we don't pigeonhole them and they don't stay in their pigeonholes. So for me, I'm always trying to make characters do something unexpectable and yet somehow plausible. But, I mean, I never ask of my characters, what would they do? I always ask, what can I make them do? And when I put the onus of that particular responsibility on myself rather than implausibly onto them, then I have the greatest opportunity to widen what they might or might not do. If that's not a satisfactory entry, ask me another one. I'll try to make it. No, I mean, really, I mean, you know, what makes sense to me in talking about these kinds of choices is not always something that makes sense to someone else. I mean, I've been doing this so long. Writing is a vocation rather than a profession. So it very much is part of my lived life. And for that reason, it has some of the sort of mystery of lived life. Please.
I'm not Bruce Springsteen, but I do want to tell you that maybe Frank, in your coverage of the Katrina hurricane,
Yes.
was just so palpable. So I lived through the Katrina. My wife and I were living in Burns Township. And
Oh, you were through Katrina, you did?
yeah, and not Katrina.
No, but Sandy.
Whatever that, Sandy.
Yeah.
And I just love where you went with Frank at that time. Like the conflict of the storm versus his state of calmness at that point in his life was like taking it to the top of Frank's journey that I was on, not just Frank. Were you living in New Jersey during that?
We were living in New York, teaching at Columbia. Well, not I'm close.
No, so New Jersey got nailed too. I mean, New York got nailed.
What we did was we got in the car and drove down to Barnegat Neck, and went across Barnegat Bay, and got over to Seaside Heights, and everything was shut. We couldn't get anywhere. The police wouldn't let us in because it was all that whole neck of land down there, as you would know, was all wrecked and blown away, and so we started back. Went back across the bay and went up the Garden State back to New York, and I started thinking, gee, I know that this hurricane has caused things to happen inland, which are directly a consequence of this storm. But whatever those things are, nobody would ever suspect that they were occasioned by this storm. And so then I just started thinking, well, I can set things in the interior of New Jersey. And when I thought that, I thought, well, I know who's going to tell this story. And that's what was the motivating perception for me, which was that things happen 50 miles west of, Seaside Heights, New Jersey, which are occasioned by this terrible hurricane, but we don't attribute these events to the hurricane. And one of my preoccupations has come to be over time. It wasn't when I was young. I want stories to tell what causes what. I want stories to tell what causes love, what causes grief, what causes remorse. I want to be involved in creating in language those kinds of connective tissues between cause and effect, and there would always be causes and effects which someone would not have necessarily associated before. I mean, someplace in Walter Benjamin's wonderful essay called The Storyteller, which I recommend to any of you. It's erudite and it's a little fusty and written in the 20s. But Benjamin says about stories that stories should be useful to the reader. And what Benjamin meant when he said that was he was talking about oral stories, stories that people tell to each other, not written stories. But he believed that if you were telling a story to someone, that the story would contain how the crops did in 1899, and so his sense of what was practical was that was the kind of use that stories were. You would tell a story that took place in Istanbul, and so you would bring back the news of Istanbul. And so I thought, well, in my practice of writing stories, I have to find a way to make them useful also, because I thought that's one of the ways in which readers will value them and stay reading them. And so I thought, well, I have to find what I can tell that is useful. And what I can tell via my imagination of what is useful is what causes what. What causes, when you live in Hightstown, New Jersey, what causes you to do something that I believe is caused by the occasion of a hurricane 60 miles away?
Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the desire for the unexpected
Yeah.
and also plausibility.
Plausibility, yeah.
Plausibility, and I'm wondering, actually, I have two questions, but the first one here is, with the balance between the unexpected and the plausible, how do you bring judgment to bear on what is plausible in the midst of trying to work through the unexpected? And in other words, do you have strategies? How do you hear yourself when it comes to these kinds of creations? And then the second question, because I got the mic, is do you think about what you do as a writer as having any kinds of analogs to other kinds of activities that humans partake in?
The second question first.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, I think that writing stories, the practice of writing stories, is very much akin to how each of us goes through our days. And I don't mean that in a casual way. I mean, we are basically, throughout our days, making up the logic of our lives. We walk out of buildings and we don't know what's going to happen. And when we find out what's going to happen to us at that moment, we create a certain kind of logical tissue for why this happened and where we fit into it. And so we're constantly making these sorts of efforts to make what happens to us seem both plausible but also normal and survivable. So I do think that the simple practice of writing stories, and it's also true of reading stories, but more to my experience, writing stories, is very much like what we all do. I mean, I get to, it happens to me all the time in writing stories or essays or novels that I think to myself, I don't know what to do next. I just don't know what to do next. And that's not a crisis, it's just a feature of life. And so I figure out what to do next. That's my job, figure out what to do next. And it's very much like the rest of us. We go through our days, we think we know what to do next because we've assigned ourselves a certain kind of plausible logic which we follow, but it's actually just made up stuff for the most part. And it's okay. That doesn't cause me to think less of it because we make it up. But although it is certainly valuable in your life to do this, because your life's constantly doing this. And as far as the other question is, as I understand it, I think that the more difficult, or you might say implausible, the premise for a story, the more I am called upon as the person making that story to make the implausible plausible. And that's my job. Something interests me a lot, and I would sometimes say to myself, what am I going to do with this? It interests me. Okay, what can I possibly, where can I fit it into something? I mean, I have a story called Reunion, and it was an homage to a John Cheever story. And in this story, a man is in Grand Central Station, and across the way in Grand Central Station, he sees another man who is the husband of a woman that he has had an affair with. And what I make him do at that moment is walk across the Grand Central Station and say something to this man. Nobody would ever do that. Nobody would ever possibly do that. But I make him do it because I want to see what I'm going to say when I get him over there. And I'm going to make up lines for both of these characters, but nobody would ever do that. They would go the other way as fast as they possibly could, and so that's what I see my job to be, and when I can make difficult premises feasible. Sometimes those, because of the difficulty at their heart, sometimes the story will have a kind of a torque to it, because I've had to torque it in so many ways to make it make sense that the story's better for that.
But to come back to the question, how do you then, after you've made these attempts to do your job, how do you then understand that they are going to be plausible to someone else?
To someone else?
Yeah.
Well, because I can't dream up anything that hasn't already happened. I can't dream up anything that couldn't happen. It's just impossible. I can't do that. Because so I start off thinking that basically most of the things that we consider to be implausible just haven't happened to us yet. And so that's my underlying conception. But I also think that there is pleasure of a kind of a low grade aesthetic kind for readers who are made to accept something that they actually wouldn't normally accept. And it's happening in the pages of a book. It's a safe space. It's a privileged safe space. So if I can bring you through my own skills and felicities and addictive attention to accepting something that you maybe wouldn't accept, I think I have shown you something that's possible, but I've also given you pleasure. Because when you give in to whatever I'm trying to make you give into, there is a real sensation of pleasure for readers. Readers come to books in order to be basically worked on.
Thanks.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Earlier, you said that bad behavior makes for good writing.
Yes.
Were you quoting someone else, or is that you?
It's, I'm so old, I don't know. It could have been something I read. Let's just say it was something I read. But I don't remember who said it. Could have been a lot of people. But does it not seem true?
Absolutely, absolutely true.
Yeah. I mean, we both, all of us spend our lives trying to do right. Sometimes it's interesting when somebody makes no effort at all.
It makes for great storytelling.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we all relate to it.
And we all have a kind of lurid curiosity about that other thing that we're not, if we're, the bad. Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time. Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank everybody. Thank you for coming.